another theory that we don't see a lot of evidence for. Yes.
You don't see any of those kinds of burials in this part of the
No,
country at all?
we do not. The nearest ones would be near Rochester. South of Rochester is the Genesee Valley
Yeah.
at Squawky Hill would be the name. That was excavated in the 1950s by the Rochester Museum. There are a few there. Yes?
Any consistency or generalizations you can make from the 3 sites on the Bard campus? Is that a stretch?
Well, yeah. Actually, you said 3, Henry.
Well, yeah, you had the manor.
But I skipped one.
Oh, okay.
Because I thought, well, that's not going to add too much. So I skipped the second last one on my list here. It's called Spice Bush. It's below the grouse bluff that I was talking about where the huckleberries were. So that's on a bluff overlooking the Hudson. Down below it, going right down into the Hudson, is a place called Spice Bush, after the main plant that grows there, Lindner benzoin. And we found in a pit there with very complicated decorated pottery, looking to be the same time period, say 1,500 years ago. There was chipstone that had to have come from Ohio. It's translucent, it's reddish, and it has, I mean, it's the size of your little fingernail, but it's distinctive. You can see light through it. It looks like in this reddish stone there's a dark cloud, and then there's a streak of lightning, quartz going through it. So in miniature, it's a whole landscape of an approaching storm. So that was in this pit, along with hickory nuts.
That's the consistency.
Yeah, I love hickory and walnut. And so
And hickory and oak too, because we're in a hickory oak
you
forest.
got it.
And it's right there, we see it all the time.
Yep.
Hickory oak.
Yep, you got it. And we oftentimes find the wood, so we can also not just medicine and food, but tell what they were using for fuel, and oftentimes it's hickory and walnut and oak. Right.
You'll get any
And the little
consistencies?
creatures are very excited when they come out because they're gathering and opening right on the
Yeah,
pad.
yeah.
They're opening the seeds, the little hard hickory. Not easy.
No, it isn't, it's quite hard. Yeah. Yes?
Are there any specific indications that tell you that those bladelets were being transitioned by way of people traveling rather than just trade routes?
Not as yet, but with them, I just mentioned this translucent reddish,
Yeah.
black and white. There are pieces that are grayish that look like they came from Ohio. We don't see them as bladelets, but they're chips, and we keep looking. Some of them are almost clear, but they're not crystal. They're flint of some kind. Yeah. And so when I went to Ohio, to the place where this was quarried, east of Columbus, near this pilgrimage site that I mentioned, with the earthworks and the observatory of the moonrise, so that is very close to about a 7-mile ridge where this beautiful stone occurs, that even when it's heated up, turns bright red. And it's just spectacular, and it's translucent. So the boulders there, because this is the bedrock of Flint Ridge, Ohio, the boulders, the weathered part, are a kind of a gray, translucent gray, and that looks like what we might be finding at the forest site. We've got maybe a dozen of those, just chips right now.
So is it an igneous rock or a sedimentary?
It's a sedimentary rock.
Sedimentary.
Yeah. It's found usually in shale, sometimes some sandstone.
So how does it differ from the church that we find in the limestone here that's black? Or is it obsidian found in the No, it's west.
Now, the city is all coming, as far as I know, from the far west. The Yellowstone in particular. Yeah. Geologically, it's chert. I mean, it's this impure silicon dioxide. So it's basically glass with some impurities. And the flint technically the flint that we find actually comes from France or England and was brought over either as ballast or as gunflints.
Yeah.
And we do find some. But we're really talking technically about chert, C-H-E-R-T.
Yeah.
Yeah. And though we have some very beautiful chert, here, such as at Flint Mine Hill near Coxsackie, or West Athens Hill. It's a New York State Museum excavated. It's very lustrous, it's very multicolored. It doesn't have all the characteristics of the, technically Van Port is the geologic name of Flint Ridge. It's a spectacular material. And it contains quartz crystals as well, in raw material. Yes?
Do we have any sites with bears? Obviously ritual, a dead bear with beads around its neck. And supposedly there's a 7th century BC, somewhere in the Middle East, that has this ritual of a bear.
Well, there's Anatolia.
Anatolia, right, it's in Anatolia.
Yeah. We don't, in our immediate area, have evidence of bear ceremonialism. You get out in central New York, so that would be Haudenosaunee territory, the Iroquois people. Yeah. There is a site excavated again in the 1950s where there were parts of bear along the Seneca River and lots of pottery vessels that looked like they were being offered into the river in celebration of the bear. And so there has been a fair amount of interpretation about bear ceremonialism getting down into the Northeast from the Arctic, but getting there from the Siberia. And really it's a circumpolar phenomenon of bear ceremonialism, is what it's called, yeah. But not in this immediate area as far as I know. Yeah. It may be found, yeah. There's still many, many places to look. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
One more. How, well, or is it possible to link the peoples that are being, that you're researching by excavating these sites, and the people like the Asopas that appear in the documentary record later in the 17th century around here? Like, do we know that these are that these are the ancestors of those people? Do we know that they're not, for instance?
Yeah, we pretty much know.
Cool. I assume that was the answer.
Yeah, so Goldcrest is kind of that transition site. Also, possibly Little Falls Rock Shelter that I mentioned second. And that's why I started there.
Yeah.
At this transitional time where people are. There's evidence. So at Goldcrest, there are bits of petals that are in that same pit. Just little scraps of grass that had to have been gotten from across the river at Fort Orange or later on. So, okay.
No other signs of fish. You mentioned sturgeon, but there's no other evidence of fish.
Yes, there is. Okay. So, sturgeon is one that we've focused on, and we have an exhibit. If you want to know more about archaeology that I've done with my students, there's a website. Just Googling Bard archaeology with the whole spelling AEOLOGY. And there's a panel at the college on the Greenway Trail. It's 16 feet long, which is just a little bit bigger than the largest sturgeon, funded by the Hudson River Foundation, which has particular interest in that very ancient fish. So we find bits of sturgeon. That last site that I mentioned, I kind of gave it a rest and then I threw it in response to a question about the spice bush site, also has sturgeon. It's in that exhibit. You can see it magnified. We found a tiny piece of it. So it has a fair occurrence on the smaller island in Tivoli Bay. Let's see if it's on here. Yeah, it's right here. This is Kruger Island, and this is Magdalen Island or Goat Island. In the rock shelter there, where there was a human burial, and also lots of habitation debris, I think 4 or 5 different fish were found. And at Grouse Bluff, the one just above there, we found fish scales of I think it was a perch, maybe. No, not quite a perch. Anyway, the analyst who worked with Tanya at Peabody said, the funny thing about this is nobody would have eaten this fish, but other fish would. So clearly it was inside the fish that they were cooking on this giant fire, which we think was probably sturgeon. It is found in the site down below at Spice Bush, yes.
Did you talk with Joe Diamond about the archaeology that was done here in this building?
Yes, I have.
You have, because they discovered, I'm the architect that was in charge of the job.
Yes, indeed.
And we found, I don't know, many thousands of extinct animals and all kinds of things. But the contact period was about 2.5 feet down, I think, from the street line outside.
Yeah.
But what he found below that, I can't remember at the moment. But did he do seeds? I don't know, seeds and.
Well, the Wolferstein site that I mentioned is Joe's site. We're
Yeah.
working with a faunal analyst, Amorosi, and then David Perry, who I'm working with now, which is partly why I chose him to work with. Plus, Todd is retired. So, and the previous guy who I worked with at Little Falls Rock Shelter retired long ago. Now I'm just editing archaeology reports. That's Roger Moeller. So there aren't many of these people around. It means endless hours on a microscope. So, yes.
Is there any connection with the heart? Because as a poet, I've found a lot of connection with art and language. And I just wonder if this is unique to certain places only, or if the heart is a place that is considered a special, what did we say, you and I, about the heart? The heart
So
is,
it's just a heart, organ of spiritual perception.
the heart is the organ
That's a good question. Yeah.
of spiritual perception. And we're always concerned with doing, and then being, of course, is the love part, and that thing is beginning to get a little more interest now. I know my teacher at NYU gave me a book that introduced me to Buddhism, and it was because he thought I was the only one in the class who could understand the poetic nuance of the heart. And it happened to be true, by the way. I mean, I do care about that.
I would hope, yeah. I can't say that I think of any archaeologically. I think hearts are, there are designs of hearts on moccasins, heated moccasins, if I'm not mistaken. So that might be a lead for you. Yeah, but
Well, in the
archaeologically,
movie of Dick, Last of the Mohicans,
yeah.
the Mohawks attacked the British, and one of the leaders of the Mohawks killed the general and took out his heart and ate it.
Whoa.
There you go.
Right on the spot.
Yeah, okay.
That was traditionally, I think,
Is that in the book, or did Hollywood add that? But yeah, there was ritual cannibalism in warfare in historic times, particularly among the Iroquois groups.
Yeah.
So the Mohawks are a member of that group. Yes, Mary?
I wondered if there was anything you wanted to share with us that you took from your research in the area about the Esopus Valley or our site here at the Pearson House, if there's some
Yeah.
sweeping something. you
Yeah, I
talked
can't, I honestly, I think this place is terrific, but I can't really speak to.
Or the
what was found
valley.
here. But the valley, yeah. There's a site that I didn't include in my presentation because of partly who I was trying to introduce. So the Hurley site that we've talked about, which was excavated over many, many years by a person who lived just down the road from Hurley. And it was one of my students organized the materials at the State Museum as her internship, and then just a few years ago, they overturned a long-standing understanding that people in this area were not heavily invested in corn agriculture, maize agriculture. And now it looks like they were, based on that one particular site, the Hurley site. There are hundreds of pits there full of bird corn and other plant materials.
What did you say the plant's name was?
Maize.
Maize.
M-A-I-Z-E. which is to distinguish other meanings of the word corn. See how it names. Yes.
What do you think about, I think it was Robert Jewett's account of when Henry Hudson came up the Hudson, that the sturgeon were so thick that you could walk on them? I believe that's what was in his diary.
Yeah, I think it's the alewives that they were walking on, supposedly. The sturgeon are at the bottom,
Okay.
the bottom feeders. But, yeah, I think that the fish were very abundant at that time. And the sturgeon was almost fished to extinction around 1900. Partly habitat change, but partly over-exploitation. It's coming back, it's endangered in the Hudson. In the exhibit that I mentioned to you, which you can see on the Greenway Trail, but you can also find on the BARD website, although it's been down recently. It talks about, let's see, where do I want to go with this? The sturgeon, I'm sorry, I suddenly lost track of your question.
How thick, how many fish
Oh, yeah,
were
the
there?
fish, right. So you'll see sturgeon all along the Hudson, so it has a map of all the occurrences of the sturgeon that have been found. And it has about the extinction. At one time, Hyde Park was known as the caviar capital of the world because of the concentration of Atlantic sturgeon between there and Columbia County, Greene County. So it's really the focus of the fishing. And it does get up tributaries, such as the Soda Lakes and other tributaries. It gets past the waterfalls. So I think Joe found it at Wolferstein, in fact. So it must have been brought inland several miles to get to that site. Yes?
Do you think they were, like, people might have been traveling to fish at those spots too? Because I know Joe's also found them kind of far afield from the river. Like, he's found them down in New Paltz, for
Certainly.
instance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we really have got to understand how much people travel.
Yeah.
Yeah, on foot, by canoe,
Thank you.
yeah. And they were in touch with other people who lived in those other places. So the long distance, short distance, but really long distance. I mean, from Hudson Valley to the Newark Earthworks in Columbus is 700 miles. Yeah. So it would have taken a month or so by canoe and portage and so forth. But very possibly they did it. We know they were coming from as far away as Alabama, based on the pottery, what's in the pottery, that you can, identify the minerals. Yeah, so they are traveling long distances to Ohio, but also from Ohio to get those raw materials. Yeah, and where I was going with the exhibit that I mentioned is that one of the BARD students did her BARD thesis and then her master's thesis at BARD on a site where sturgeon is really focused north of Catskill called Tufano. And there were sturgeon remains in pits sort of intermingled with human remains and deer remains. And Audrey Reifler, who did that study, had the tools made at Vassar by Lisa Johnson, and then she had people who normally butcher sturgeon and deer. Richard is a person who hunted deer a lot, and then she studied the wear on the edges of the tools under the microscope and compared it to the specimen. So you can see they were using those tools, which are the size of your hand, not a foot, on both of those animals. So it's an example of this kind of study of still tools that we do to try to get at what they were used for. Okay. I'm running out of voice here.
What is the deepest dig that you've done? And do you think that if one digs deeper, there is more to be found?
It all depends. So the site at BARD that I mentioned is only a few inches deep. You go 5 centimeters or 2 inches, and you can identify a fireplace. Because it was never cultivated. It was part of an estate of the Livingston family. They didn't need to grow crops everywhere. So it was preserved. That's the forest site. I would mention, though, that sites can go in this area down at least 9 or 10 feet. And for that, I would reference a site on the Catskill Creek that was going to be a Walmart. Was going to be a Walmart. But the tribe, the Mohican Nation, hired me as a consultant because my specialty initially was deep sites on river floodplains and how they could be buried and preserved. So that's what I was doing at the New York State Museum and with the University at Albany for my doctorate. And so that site was preserved partly because there were layer upon layer of Mohican history. About every 200 years we could identify a site based on the pottery. It wasn't at the surface because it was deeply buried enough to never have been hit by the plow. So we had nothing about it, but when the archaeologists from Walmart went out there, they started finding things, finding pits. You can see a Dutch trading post that was across the creek. And then going back about